Let's turn to Romans 14 Unplugged, Feast and Fast and Food. Oh my. Let's make that a little bigger. And let's go jump back into where we left off last week. We're reading through the conclusion section of this particular study, and we're in the middle of a quote from Mark Nanos. For some of you, this is a bit difficult to, go through all the historical portions of a study in order to gain the background and an appreciation for any particular Bible book. But I promise you that if you can discipline yourself to actually do a little bit of research, you don't have to do weeks and months and years of research to figure out what an author is writing in any particular Bible book. But if you can just allow maybe a Bible commentary or some other resource to give you just, maybe an hour's worth of information, as little as that, can help you better plug into how to maybe even understand what an author wrote about thousands of years ago, and then better not only appreciate that, but then better make some practical application for your current current 21st century application. So we're looking into the background of the book of Romans so that we can better get a handle on or wrap our minds around what was the social situation that Paul was facing, what particular communities he was working with, and some of the social religious dynamics and things like that. And then from there, we can perhaps maybe begin to pray about how can we make some everyday connection and to what was written, 2,000 plus years ago. We've got an ancient text in front of us, and yet does it speak to us today? Well, if we believe that the Holy Spirit is making the Bible relevant for us, then the answer must be yes. So let's look at this. This is my own commentary. We're still looking at the something that drives most Bible commentaries' understanding of the book of Romans, which is the not just who Paul wrote to, but the immediate expulsion of the Jewish people by Emperor Claudius, which took place, as far as we can tell, historians tell us, this took place, maybe even 5 to 10 years immediately before Paul wrote the letter. So he wrote the letter, say, sometime in the mid-50s of his era. The expulsion took place, some people put it as early as, I think, 49 of that year. Some people put it around 53 or something like that. So we're talking about something that's very probably still recent on their mind. So let's look at this. This is still Mark Nanos, and he's challenging, he's a Jewish historian, he's not a Messianic Jew, but he's of the impression that there were probably more Jewish people who were allowed to stay than we give credit for, and that would make the Jewish presence in Rome stronger than what we assume it to be from our perspective today, meaning when Paul wrote the letter, he probably had still some semblance of a Jewish community work with, and therefore the Gentile Christians that he was writing to, the brothers in the group, the Gentile Christians who were the product of the churches that had formed from the Messianic Jewish groups that had spilled over into Gentile Christian groups. From Paul's perspective, Paul wanted Gentiles to stay connected to Jewish people if at all possible. And if we have a sizable amount of Jewish people there in Rome, then this would be something that Paul could make an appeal to. Otherwise, perhaps maybe Paul's telling them, hey, you know what? Break away, break off on your own, form your own separate groups. The Jewish community has been decimated, and God still has them under judgment, so don't worry about them. Don't concern yourself with them. Just create your own groups, create autonomy, stay separated, and go on your merry way. But we know that Paul's unlikely that that's the way that Paul wrote. And so Mark Nanos is going to postulate this idea that the church groups, the Gentile Christian groups, were still connected to a vibrant Jewish community, even though the Jewish community has suffered some damage because of the expulsion. So let's pick up the commentary there. He says, first, it is unlikely that all or even much of the Jewish community was expelled from Rome by Claudius. So that's one of his initial thesis statements right up front. He's working from the idea. Now, I'm not saying that he's right and that all the rest of history is wrong, or, like read about the account in the book of Acts where it talks about the Jews being expelled. We're going to make reference to that in a moment. I'm not saying that the expulsion didn't take place, and he's not questioning it either. He's simply asking, is there a possibility that it's maybe not as widespread as we might assume it to have been? And we're looking at some of the logical practicalities of, could it have been as widespread as we've been taught? And if it wasn't, what are the implications for Paul's communities and thus for our own 21st century understanding of Paul's letter? He continues, Suetonius' report, remember, Suetonius is another historian of Paul's day that would have made some reference to what's going on and given us some details. Suetonius' report can be understood to indicate an expulsion pertaining only to those Jews who were involved in a disturbance in direct conflict with the statement in Acts 18:3 that all the Jews were expelled. So we know Luke tells us in the book of Acts that all the Jews were expelled. And it seems like it's a contradiction, but that's only on the surface. Luke says all the Jews were expelled, but then Suetonius may have only been trying to explain that it was a certain sect of Jews or a certain group of rebel-rousing, troublemaking Jews that were expelled. How can we harmonize these two accounts? I know most people are going to say, well, obviously, let's side with the Bible, right? The Holy Spirit sanctioned that. We can't say the same for Suetonius, right? He's not Holy Writ. But did Luke have to mean that all the Jews in Rome, or did he simply mean all the Jews of that certain area, or all the Jews of that particular faction, or of that particular occurrence? I mean, we have to put it in context. It could work out that way, right? That's the possibilities that we're examining. Nanos continues that neither Jewish authors such as Josephus and Philo, nor Roman historians such as Tacitus reported the event suggests that there was at most a limited action. So that's how we can perhaps understand what Luke wrote about when he says all the Jews. The larger context is perhaps he meant all the Jews of that faction, or all the Jews that were involved in the troublemaking incident, or maybe all the Jews of a certain region, or something like that. We don't have to, since Luke doesn't explicitly say all the Jews of Rome, then we can safely understand that that's possibly what he is referring to. I'll go back and look up that verse explicitly in a moment. I don't think I have it in my commentary, the Acts 15 verse. Let me just double check. Yeah, I don't see that I've got it linked here so that I could pull it up and have you guys look at it. So let's just keep looking at this. Nanos continues. This fact that, as far as to how many Jews were expelled, this fact is all the more suggestive when we're talking about it perhaps maybe being a limited number. It's all the more suggestive when it is noted that, and keep listening, all right? Listen very carefully. This isn't one historian's perspective. This, of course, is not the end-all, be-all historical account, right? I'm not trying to suggest to everyone out there, Mark Nanos has it right and everybody else has it wrong. No. What I'm trying to say is that when you're trying to do an investigative and when you're trying to do your own personal investigation of any particular historical event that we don't have all the details for, it's better to take the scientific approach where you get as much information on the table for examination as possible so that you can corroborate details and try to weed out which part is fact and which part is perhaps maybe just hearsay or rumor or something like that, okay? Let's keep going. So the fact that Luke doesn't explicitly say that it's all the Jews in Rome is all the more, and that it could in fact be maybe just a smaller group of Jews. It's all the more suggestive when it's noted that citizens, we're talking about Roman citizens, which at least a number of Jews in Rome they were Roman citizens, they could not be expelled without due process. And either way, if they were expelled, it would have constituted significant news to report. So that's what's going on. That's part of what drives Nanos's suspicion about the suggestion that, Claudius said everybody's out. Well, then that means everybody has to get out. Well, was he above the law? As a Roman emperor, could he have simply just expelled hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens without any sort of due process, without any sort of legal pushback from anyone in that day? And if he just mowed over the law, the court system said, well, hey, I'm the emperor. My law, it's my way or the highway, right? Everybody's out that's Jewish. Get out, all 50,000, 200,000 to 500,000 Jews. Get out of Rome. I don't care if you're Roman citizens. I don't care if you've got a legal connection to our city. I don't care if you're going to protest. I don't care if you're going to get your lawyers to try and step in and help you out. Get out, get out, get out. All right. If that took place, shouldn't the other historians have reported that? Shouldn't Josephus have said something about that? Or Philo or someone like that? That's kind of the assumption that we're kind of working from. We just have to work with what we've got, the scant amount of history that's left for us. Let's keep reading. Indeed, it would have supported Tacitus's negative description to note that even when citizens, Jews and converts were a threat to Roman political order. We can read about that in Tacitus' account, or might have been Josephus' account there. Moreover, De Cassius, who's another historian, writes specifically that Claudius did not expel the Jews of Rome, but only restricted their meetings, and the rationale he supplies us is that there were simply too many Jews to do so without creating a crisis in that particular part of Rome. So consider this. The Jews of that day formed a sizable amount of Roman citizens. If 200,000 to 500,000 Jews suddenly picked up their businesses and left town, don't you think that would have a negative impact on the surrounding or the surviving or the remaining communities? Yeah, there would be an absence of businesses, an absence of communal connection, if they were suddenly forced out. So we've got to consider this when we read about the description in the book of Acts, and we hear people say, well, yeah, all the Jews got kicked out. And, well, that's just too bad. Really? If you stop and think about some of the details that would have to be in place if they really did get kicked out. Let's keep reading Nanos here. If perhaps Dio, the other Roman historian there, I think he was a Christian as well, if he was referring to a different incident in the reign of Claudius, as some suggest, right? Maybe there was more than one event that the historian was reporting. Then maybe he skipped over this cataclysmic incident when Jews were expelled, making the construct all the more suspect. We're talking about the possibility or the probability or whatnot of how to understand the historical account of the expulsion, and whether or not we as today's modern 21st century Bible students can stand to gain from perhaps maybe allowing that maybe enough Jewish people were still around for Paul to assume that the Gentile Christians should stay connected to those Jewish communities and work with one another. Or was Paul suggesting something that would be later categorized as some form of supersessionism, replacement theology, where the church has overtaken Israel's place in the covenants? God's no longer concerning himself with the Jewish people, and Paul wants the Gentile Christians to form their religious theology and their social, communal policies over and against and away from the Judaisms. That's really the details that we're entertaining here. Let's conclude this section. Nano says that the author of Acts can also observe that the Jewish leaders in Rome have little first-hand knowledge of the Christ followers, but understand this to be a sect of Judaism that is spoken against elsewhere. Recall Acts chapter 28, verses 17 to 22. Go back and read that on your own. This particular detail of the story suggests that although the writer Luke also mentions the wholesale expulsion, right? It's the same writer. Luke does not link this to a disturbance over Christ or with fellow Christ followers. And in fact, he does not state why the Jews had been expelled, including Aquila and Priscilla, right? They were Paul's fellow Messianic Jewish teachers there in Rome. And we already talked about the fact that if the Jews were expelled, the Messianic Jews would have also been expelled. And there's a strong possibility, even a probability, that many Christians would have been swept up along with the expulsion. Not because Rome was trying to wipe out just Gentile Christians at this point in time, but because of the well-known fact, even by today's Christian standards, it's a well-known fact that first century Gentile Christianity in Paul's day was essentially a sect of Judaism. They were underneath the religious identifications of Judaisms. Even if they didn't call themselves Judaism, they've been referred to as either Christians or followers after the way or Nazarenes, things like that, other titles. Some may have used the term some form of Judaism, depending on which denomination of Christianity in Paul's day that you were attached to. But nevertheless, for Rome to be able to easily identify Gentile Christians as over and against religious Jews of that day, I don't think would have been an easy task. We're going to find out that it wasn't until after the destruction of the temple and moving closer into some of the later Jewish revolts, then that Rome was able to finally be able to distinguish and make separations between the Christian groups and the Jewish groups, and begin to persecute the Jewish groups all the more. Eventually, they would persecute the Christians as well until they joined them, right? Until Constantine became a Christian himself. But that's for a later study, a different study. Let's keep reading Mark Natos. He says, second, it's unlikely that the expulsion mentioned was precipitated by disputes about Jesus Christ, right? Keep in mind that there were enough heated debates in the synagogue over Yeshua that didn't always spill out over into Roman communities that would require, say, Caesar to step in and silence the crowd. Now, there are some incidents in the book of Acts that we can read about that caught the attention of the synagogue authorities, and even the Sanhedrin had to step in from time to time, the synagogue authorities, people like that, and imprison some of the apostles and, try to calm, make peace and things like that. But we're talking about a dispute over who Yeshua is that was supposedly big enough to cause the Jews to have to be kicked out. Suetonius elsewhere, remember he's a first century historian, he discusses the Christiani under Nero rather than the Christiani under, and that's from his account in Nero. Notice the difference in the spellings there. Christiani. That's not a typo in my commentary. That's actually the possibility of the similarity in names over perhaps the topic of the disputes themselves that led to the expulsion. The Christiani and the Christiani may have simply been two different yet similar sounding issues that were taking place in that day. And this was following the other historian Tacitus, who already knew of the Christiani. So, we just have to kind of work with what we've got historically. Maybe there were two separate incidents that we're discussing here. Third, Nano says, it is curious to suppose that Romans would have expelled Jews, perhaps citizens, at least those with long-standing tradition, which were generally respected in the communities, but not also expelled the non-Jews meeting in their midst, remember the Christians, perhaps many not citizens, even slaves, who could not similarly appeal to previous latitude based on observing ancient traditions. So again, we're just examining the possibilities of the expulsion in the first century. We've got Roman citizens. They're Jews, but they're Roman citizens. Supposedly, they get kicked out, but what about the non-Jews? We know there were lots of non-Jews meeting with Jews in the synagogues and in the assemblies and the church groups. We know this because we have the Bible's account. read through the book of Acts. We know that Jews and Gentiles were meeting together. It was no secret. And they weren't doing it in secret. They weren't hiding anything from Rome. And yet, supposedly for many, many years, Rome didn't have any problem with Jews and non-Jews meeting together. They didn't have a problem with the proselyte program in the first century, Gentiles converting to Judaism and things like that. And yet suddenly, if all of these Jewish Roman citizens were expelled, don't you think that some of those non-Jewish yet Roman citizens, or maybe slaves or the plebs, you've heard historical accounts of some of the lower class Roman peoples or barbarians or peoples that were joining in and joining Christianity at the time. Don't you think some of them who, they even had less of an appeal option in there, they didn't have any legal standing. Maybe they couldn't afford it. Maybe their social class just didn't allow it for it. Don't you think they would have been swept away without even the blink of an eye? I mean, they were practicing the religion of Judaism, right? They were God-fearers, which was part and parcel with Judaism. It resembled Judaism. It was basically the same thing without converting. So we've got to look at these details and consider them as we're talking about topics like this. Let's keep reading through Nanos. I think we'll be able to finish the quote tonight. Nanos says, would they, speaking about these lower social groups, in other words, the higher up the social chain you went, the more affordability it was given you to perhaps making maybe an appeal or to fight against any type of expulsion or anything like that. But the lower on down the rung you fell, then there was not much you could do. Would these people groups be left in Rome? Talking about the non-Jews, would they be left in Rome to carry on meetings involving the name Christ? Watch this, if already groups associated with that name had provoked significant disturbances of the peace to have led to the expulsion of the Jewish community in the first place. I think this is a powerful, logical option that we're looking at here. So follow along. If you weren't making sense of what Nanos just says, let me see if I can break this part down for you, because this is really strong. So supposedly, according to the common 21st century understanding of the expulsion from Rome and how it impacted Paul's communities, and this is mainly by mainstream Christian authors that have this particular perspective. Christians, by today's standards, who don't feel any need to make any connection to current Jewish Judaisms or religions. This is mainstream Christianity that, without knowing it, kind of endorses the kind of replacement theology, dispensational supersessionism perspective, where the Torah is out, the New Testament's in, the Old Testament's out, Israel's out, the Jewish people have been replaced. Now that's kind of the harsh version of it, but even still, when you have Gentile Christians today who just are disinterested in returning to any sort of Jewish lifestyle or studying Israel's Torah or anything like that, just because they feel that the Christianities have already been established as the new people group of God, or at least for now, the people group of God, if you're a dispensationalist. Consider this. Let's suppose in the first century that Emperor Claudius was able to expel all of the Jews from Rome. Let's just run with that for a moment. Let's suppose he got them all out. Let's say, by most estimates, anywhere from 200,000 to 500,000. Consider this. We got a lot of Jewish people who were supposedly expelled from Rome. Now, according to most Christian accounts today, I'm not saying all, but a good number, the supposed reason for the expulsion had something to do with supposedly the Messianic Jews were arguing with the non-Messianic Jews about the possibility of Jesus being the Messiah, right? So we had this heated debate of who Jesus was in the synagogues between Jews who were national Jews and Jews who were Messianic Jews, right? So Christian Jews. And so this spilled out over into the communities, big enough to cause Rome to take notice. And then Rome said, that's it. Get out. You guys are talking about this Christiani fellow or whatever, or concept. Get out and take your discussion with you. Just get out of Rome. Don't cause us any problems anymore, right? Get out. So let's suppose that that's what took place. All of the Jews get kicked out. And why did they get kicked out? What sparked the expulsion? It was because of their discussions about this Christianity or Christianity. Notice I'm playing with the two different spellings of the name. So if that's the case, who was left behind? The Christian Gentiles. And what are they going to keep doing? They're going to keep talking about Christ, and they're going to be identified as Christians. They're not identified as pagans. They're not identified as Jews anymore. They're not identified as proselytes, right? Because all of that program got kicked out. So what Mark Nanos is challenging us with the idea is that supposedly under this story that we think about today, that supposedly the Christian Gentiles were allowed to stay behind and have their discussions about the very person that got the Jews kicked out, but the Christians aren't going to have any problem talking about the same fellow? Don't you think Rome? You think Rome just accepted this Christian fellow, but they had a problem with Jews talking about Christ, but they didn't have a problem with Gentiles talking about Christ? Notice the odd inconsistencies if that's really the case. So that's really all we're looking at. I mean, that's a powerful argument. I'm not saying it doesn't have any pushbacks and doesn't bring with it its own set of questions, but it does add some more discussion to the table as we're looking at the possibilities of what really took place in that day. So let's conclude this particular part of my study with this quote from Nanos. Fourth, and most importantly, Paul's approach, right? Because really at the end of the day, we as Christians are really concerned most about what the Bible says. So we're going to take up most of our authority, our final authority, from what history we have left for us and preserved for us in the Bible. Paul's approach to the non-Jews and Romans, the Christians, is not what one might expect if they were in fact in positions of power and using that power to exclude or discriminate against Jewish Christ-following brothers and sisters within their small groups. Notice when Paul wrote his letters, be careful when you're reading those letters to try to notice who the recipients of his letters are, catch the tone of his letters, the rhetoric of his letters, the intended instructions to his letters, and the rebuke, if any. And so when you're reading particularly through the book of Romans, when you start to slow down in the chapters of 9 through 11, this is just my suggestion, you're going to notice how Paul zeroes in on Israel, national Israel, stumbling, blinded Israel, and how the Gentile Christians have a responsibility to do their part in salvation history as regards, number one, they, the Gentile Christians, were grafted from their position into a place within God's family, Abraham's family. And number two, they were now in a place where they, the Gentile Christians, had the gospel that they needed to share with stumbling Israel. So this is really one of the foundational points that we should kind of return to over and over again. Would Paul have wanted the Gentile Christians to form their own separate groups, to be completely locally autonomous, to have a mindset that kind of fed into the replacement theology concept, the dispensational displaced supersessionism idea? Would Paul have endorsed that idea? Is that what he was instructing the Gentile Christians of Rome? I say to that, the answers to those questions, I say no. I don't think that's what he was teaching. All right, and so in conclusion, what are some of my commentary is, so much for the boring quote-unquote history lesson for today. Let us now turn to a bullet point listing of the additional topics of our study, and that's where we'll pick up next week. We'll just remind ourselves again once more of the scope and style of the study. We'll look at all the bullet points, and then we're actually ready to start looking at this bullet point, which reads, what exactly does nothing is unclean in itself imply? So we're going to really start looking at this discussion on the topic that's related to, I think, the main topic in the section of Romans 14, which is food and table fellowship and things like that. But that'll do it for Romans 14 Unplugged, Feast, Fast, and Food. Oh my.